Shakina, thanks so much for inviting me and for that introduction. I realized actually as I was thinking about what we're going to talk about tonight and thinking about the two articles that I think some of you may have read ahead, um, that maybe actually my title was wrong. I don't know if that's a great way to start out, but I'm going to start by actually changing the title. Because I realized saying, what do we really know, suggests that we know a lot about university access. And part of the challenge is that we don't actually know all that much about university access. And so what I and some of my grad students have been doing for the last, um, more than a decade has been trying to figure out how we could know and how we could really try to um, to push other people to be asking, uh, asking questions about what's really happening with access, and how in our own context at OISE, we could not only find out what we're doing, but maybe also model some of that. So, when we kind of figured out ways that we could study access at OISE, we tried to share that at conferences, publish about it, just to give other people some ideas. I have to say, when I first started doing research on access, like I say, more than a decade ago, I really thought it was just going to be a matter of hunting around in the literature and finding the right articles and then just following what everybody else was doing. And it always amazes me. We've got so many people working around the world on some of the same concerns, but there's still so much work to be done. So we just couldn't find stuff that really fit what we were able to do, especially in Ontario. So anyway, we ended up kind of making things up as we went along, and that's some of what I'm going to share with you um, tonight. And um, so I'm going to start with one of the things that I've really been working on in my own writing, and in really thinking and talking about all of this, is to try to think about how we're using terms and what might be implied by terms. And I mean, one of the things I'm going to be talking about in a little bit is sort of how we try to uncover some of the assumptions that might be underlying access programs. And I think just going back to the language is a good place to start for that. So I'm just going to go back to the very beginning. Some of this may seem a little bit silly, but I think you'll see why I'm doing this in a few minutes. So an applicant, right? Imagine an applicant, right? In that word is the word apply. So they're applying, they're really requesting something. So we have an applicant. And the next the next term we often use is access. And if you think about how that's used just in everyday life, we ask for, well, we have access cards, right, to get into buildings. We ask for permission to access a website, to access a webinar. So access is really about being granted entry into the space. And one of the things that's interesting about access is I mean, I've shown kind of, well, that's supposed to be a door there in the wall. And the reason for that is that I think when we talk about access, there really is this assumption that there's somebody guarding the door, right? And making the decisions about who can come in and who can't. Okay, so that's the second word that I think is really worth thinking about and really um, thinking about the images that it brings to people's minds. Okay, and then barriers. Okay, we talk about barrier. This is a term we use all the time when we're talking about admissions and we're talking about access, right? Is that there are barriers to participation, there are barriers to getting in. And I think, again, this may sound a little bit silly, but I think that when we use that word, even if we as writers or speakers aren't necessarily thinking of literal barriers, right? Like a wall that you can't get through or that you've got to break through to get there. Even if that's not necessarily what we're thinking about, sometimes we're just kind of, drawing on what other people have written or talked about, and they've used the term barriers. I think it does still, again, it's a common word. I think it does still, for many people, kind of conjure that idea that yeah, there's something between the person and where they want to go. And you think about the other terms that we use when we talk about access. We talk about hurdles. And actually a bit of a different image, isn't it? Like the hurdle, see, I mean, that's something that you get over, right? And it might be a bit difficult to get over, but it seems more possible than a barrier, for example, right? So again, just trying to think about, when I look at the literature on barriers, there are 3 types of barriers that are usually written about. And Laura Perna in the US has done some great work about access programs and so forth. Perna, P-E-R-N-A. And this is the way she divides it up, is that the first type of barrier is people just not having an adequate academic preparation, right? Or not having the academic skills and knowledge that they need in order to be able to get to where they want to go. The second is a lack of information, right? And we're going to talk in a few minutes about some of the things that universities and colleges try to do to try to improve access. And this is a pretty common one that they try to I think some universities think, oh, people aren't applying here. Maybe they don't know about us, right? Maybe we just need to give them the information, and that will remove that barrier, and they'll be able to get in. I want us to come back and talk a bit critically about that. And then the third type of barrier is cost. And in Perna's work, what she finds, and you all are not going to find this surprising, what she finds is cost is the one that governments usually choose first, right? So it's interesting. I think universities choose the information, will provide more information. Governments tend to think if only people had access to money, they'd be able to get where they want to go. That's the only problem. So those are 3, types of barriers. And again, I think it's worth really being thoughtful about, about the use of that word barrier, and if that's really what we always mean, and what we're doing in trying to remove those barriers. Are we trying to, actually, another big term that I don't include in the next few slides, but I probably should, is pathways, right? We talk a lot about trying to create pathways. And again, I would just ask you to think about the image that's there, right? So, we're talking like creating a pathway, gives us the idea that we're creating a road. Maybe people just didn't know about the road, or they didn't, if they, they weren't able to access the other roads. And if we just make a road, and maybe we need to make multiple roads. And again, I mean, that's something I think we need to be careful about as well. Sometimes we talk about, multiple pathways. And again, what are we implying with that? What are the assumptions behind that? Okay, admission. is, very much related to access. I mentioned that with access, there's this assumption that there's somebody controlling access to a space. I think with admission, the same idea, there's somebody controlling that. And, we're hopefully going to convince them to let us in, to admit us to the program or the space. And the reason that I have this slide where I've put in the welcome is, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Sarah Ahmed's work, AHMED. She's a really amazing academic, was in UK universities for quite a while. And I think she's actually kind of an independent academic at the moment. But she's done she's written this really powerful book called On Being Included. And it's all about the experience of people within universities. She talked to sort of equity and diversity officers, people with that kind of title in universities in the UK and in Australia. And how universities, well, often they seem to think they're done when they hire somebody into that kind of a position and give them that kind of a role. And great, they've one of the things they've done is they've said welcome, right? They have somebody there, they're saying welcome. That should be enough. One of the really powerful points that Ahmed makes in that research is that the very fact that we often will say when we're trying to encourage people to apply to a program or to apply to a job in a university or college is we'll say exactly like, we welcome applications from students who are Indigenous, students who are Francophone, students who are the first in their family to attend post-secondary. And in saying that, we're very clearly signaling that the people who are saying that are in the position to decide, right? That yes, they're welcoming, they're encouraging applications now, but they could just as easily not, right? And that it's their decision as people who are already inside. And so that there's a real need to be, one of my grad students and I a few years ago did a small study where we went and we just analyzed all of the wording from all of the BEd programs in Ontario and how they addressed some of these. And it was very much often, we encourage applications from, and then we tried to kind of look at what else they said there. But very much, it's very clear that I think most of that wording was very well intentioned. But again, Ahmed's point about just really, really thinking about what that wording might inadvertently communicate. Spaces is one of the things we often talk about. We have a certain number of spaces, and especially in Ontario, those of you who may know a bit about the inner workings of Ontario education know that colleges and universities are actually told by the government how many students they'll receive funding for. And that's actually the bulk of the funding for students, right? Is in many cases is the government funding. There's also some tuition, but government funding is a big piece of it. And if you accept more students than that, you're kind of on your own with those. You're not going to get the funding. If you accept too few, you won't get the amount of funding you would be able to get. And so there's a whole, there's a whole, trying to figure out exactly how to fill the spaces. And as I say, it's very political. But the reason I want to talk specifically about something as, maybe um, kind of boring and detailed as spaces in programs, um, is that when we talk about access and admissions, there are really two big categories that I want us to think about. One is screening. So that's especially important when we have a situation where we actually have lots of spaces and we could take pretty much everybody who applies. And so the goal in admissions in a situation like that is screening to make sure that the people coming in are actually a good match for the program. So, I mean, we can either do that by saying, do you have the skills and knowledge that our program is assuming that you're going to have when you come in? The other way, and I'll get to this in a couple of minutes, is we could say, here are the people who are interested in our program. We actually have space for them. Um, or even if we will make space for them. And maybe we need to change, we might have to change the program a little bit to meet people where they are. And so one of the things in the decade of really close work, some of my colleagues and students and I did with the BEd program, for example, we found that as we sort of did an access initiatives, many of which involved changing admissions, we actually then had to change the program to make sure that things still lined up. So it doesn't always have to be kind of the program is set and the potential students need to fit. Of course, it could be the other way around. The other is selection, and that's where we really get into where there's a lot of competition for programs, and that's where you get like medical programs, for example, talking about the best and the brightest, right? We had one of our doctoral students recently did a dissertation about how people are selected into medical training programs, and the number of times best and brightest appeared in the first draft of the dissertation was really amazing. And it made me real. I mean, that is just the way that's the way they're talking all of the time. And they think the rest of the world in higher ed talks like that. Um, so are you the best? And then of course it gets into what is meant by best. And very often that ends up being you're the best fit for the program as it is now. You're the people who it's the easiest for us to recognize are going to thrive in the program because you're just like the people who have thrived in the program in the past. And so we're just going to kind of continue that and not think about. So when we get into selection, it really, like all of this conversation about access and admissions and how we could make sure that it's working well and how we could improve it, I think it's even more important. Um, and yeah, and even more of a challenge probably. Um, just a couple of other things while I'm kind of sharing the things that I've been thinking about as a foundation for this. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately is often in our access programs, in our admissions, we use GPA, right? Like that is just, and especially in Canadian programs where there usually isn't testing. And testing is a whole nother set of problems, but we use GPA. It's super easy to use. You can put it into a spreadsheet. You can sort people by the spreadsheet. You can say, look at what I'm doing. It's really transparent and easy to understand and so forth. Um, but really it's not about GPA. It really is about skills and knowledge. And so I think one of the challenges, and this is something that within OISE, actually in the MT program right now, um, a small group of my grad students and I and some other professors are collaborating to try to figure out what other kind of evidence we ought to be looking at as we're trying to do admissions for the MT program, right? Especially our intuition, and I'm not sure that there's a whole lot of research on it, but our intuition suggests that getting great marks in your previous schooling may not be the predictor of the best, of somebody being the absolutely the best teacher. Sometimes it's probably good to have a little empathy for students who may struggle a little bit. So yeah, we're really trying to figure out what that would look like to have other evidence, because, just like anywhere else, it's so easy for OISE to just have the registrar's office look at the transcripts and pull out the GPA and use that as the first. And if we don't actually have really deliberate conversations about it, that's exactly what happens in all of OISE's, actually in all of OISE's programs, is the registrar does kind of a first screen on GPA and then tells us whether somebody, whether they even think we ought to consider somebody for application. So um, that's again probably a bigger conversation, and something that I also know there is the MT is the kind of biggest conversation going on right now, but it's certainly a conversation that I know is going on with some of our other programs too, to really think about what might be some other. And then I mentioned bridging a few minutes ago, which is saying, we need you, especially if we're in a teacher training program. The kids out in the schools need you, right? You may not fit exactly what are the students that our program has been designed for, but is there some way that we can build a bridge there? And add a piece to our program that might make that work better and get you there. So while I'm talking about, that's it for my little people and kind of stick figures. So I just have a couple of more ideas that I want to share with you before I kind of get into the research. And these are ideas that we've been coming back to over and over and over again in our research as just really helpful in thinking about issues of access in particular. So I have the reference on the slide here to an article by Ball et al., who are working out of the UK. In some of the work, I'll just to give you a bit of a background. We had a team a few years ago that actually got some funding from the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario to do a survey across Ontario universities of what kinds of access programs they had. And what we found is everybody was talking about, in terms of underrepresented groups. And so, we spent a lot of time talking to registrars and looking through materials and so forth at kind of what groups were considered to be underrepresented. And that's a really important place to begin. So, for example, we know there's repeated research in Ontario that shows that our Indigenous students are underrepresented in post-secondary, and there's all kinds of history for why that's the case, including the fact that until a few decades ago, um, people risked losing their status if they left their community to go to a post-secondary institution. So not surprisingly, many of the Indigenous youth who are interested in going to post-secondary would be the first in their families to go. And so that's that's just one example. I mean, many of you, I'm sure, know a lot more about some of that history. But even within, so Indigenous or underrepresented, um, students with disabilities are underrepresented, racialized students are underrepresented. But within those groups, there's also a lot of variability. And one of the things that we found, and I think you all won't find this surprising, is many of the access programs that we um, that we well, actually, that universities were really proud of, that they were telling us about when we were asking them about access programs, um, was they were really more kind of talent search programs, I think was the way we ended up kind of describing them. Where, for example, Queens and Western and University of Toronto all wanted to increase the number of Indigenous students, which is absolutely great. The problem was, if you looked closely at some of the programs, they were fighting over the small number of Indigenous students who probably were going to go to university anyway, right? Who, for whatever reason, had already been able to get on the track to university and were already embedded on that track, right? And so having these universities fight over a handful of students about whose numbers they get to help really doesn't help things very much at the Ontario-wide level, right? It makes a university look better, but really what we need is to be going beyond that. And so the embedded versus contingent, this idea we found really, really helpful. The main idea, and the reason I have a picture of a chute here, a slide, is that's the way I tend to picture it. Students who are embedded and are making embedded choices about post-secondary, they're already in a chute that heads towards post-secondary, right? So these are the kids who, if they went home at Thanksgiving or over a holiday, they sat down with their family and they said, "Hey, family, I'm not going to go to college or university," there would be a family crisis, right? Like, it's always been assumed that they're going to go. And for them to get out of that chute that is taking them to university, right, would actually take a lot of effort. It's not that they're having to try to go to university. Everything, their teachers, everything is pushing them in that direction. And it's just assumed that they're going to go. And we do have, within every group, there's going to be some people who have managed to get into an embedded situation, which is fabulous. They're probably not the students we really need to think about with the access programs, and fighting over them in our access programs is probably not going to be all that helpful in the bigger scheme of things. The contingent students, on the other hand, the way I picture it is really the opposite of this. So if you turn the chute upside down and you have um, this convex surface, and in order for the student to get to post-secondary and stay there, they are constantly every day having to stay on the top of that upside down chute, right? So there's everything in their environment, in their schools, and their families you know, are making it easy for them to get off. Sometimes it's pulling them off. They've got other responsibilities. They've got people discouraging them. They've got teachers saying, that's not for you. Don't worry about it, right? Those are all things, financial things are making it really easy for them to, so they're actually getting to post-secondary is contingent on everything going right and continuing to go right, right? And so those, I guess, I mean, it's obvious where I'm going with this, right? Those are the kinds of access programs that we kept coming back to and trying to find the access programs that really are going to help the students who are contingent. So I offer those concepts to you as maybe they'll be useful in your own work, this idea of embedded versus contingent. Um, and then one last thing I wanted to mention is just the peril of euphemisms. And I say this because this was one of, I mean, I don't know that I ever loved euphemisms, but this was one of the things that some of our work has really driven home for me. So now very recently, U of T has started doing a survey of students. Many of you may have received a request for it about demographics, right? Actually asking people a bit more detail. That's brand new, and that's really, really encouraging. That's something actually that student groups had gotten a promise for from the provost's office, I think at least 3 years ago, and it's only just happened. But if you look at most of the materials and up to this point, the only things that universities in Ontario have asked about are you Francophone? Do you have, are you Aboriginal was the terminology they were using in 2005. Indigenous would be more up to date. Are you a person with a disability? Are you somebody who's the first in your family to attend college? And so those are the things that you will see asked about in university and college applications, because those are the things that government has been asking the institutions to report on. And where did those come from? Those came from Bob Ray's report that he did in 2005, where he went around Ontario and consulted widely to try to figure out who was underrepresented, what groups were underrepresented. And I had to include this quote. This is from the report. First generation children represent a large portion of high school entrants who do not go on to post-secondary studies. They represent many of the traditionally underrepresented groups that are a focus in this report: low-income Ontarians, Aboriginal peoples, and many racial minorities. And then you notice what happened, right? So he mentions low income here, and he mentions racialized minorities, and they didn't end up in the four groups. And when I've gone back and talked to people who, some of my colleagues who were involved in some of the conversations at the time, they say very clearly what happened was we all knew that first generation was supposed to be a euphemism. It wasn't supposed to be initially, and you'll see this actually in Ministry of Training Colleges and Universities materials, where initially the definition was very broad and people were told, it's okay if you have people who aren't literally the first in their family to attend, that's all right, as long as they face some other barriers because of being low income or racialized minority or whatever. Like, be really broad in this. And of course, you can imagine what happened is because that was a euphemism, but the fact that it's a euphemism doesn't always stay with it. It's certainly not in government agencies. And what happened pretty quickly was that the group within the ministry that was in charge of these programs changed, and they looked at what was happening and said, oh my goodness, this is so sloppy. How are we supposed to actually, do any evaluation, hold groups hold universities accountable for access and so forth? And so they very quickly tightened up the definitions, tightened up the programs, and we lost that breadth that everybody just kind of was supposed to tacitly know was in there. So I share that with you, as I think it's really difficult often talking about these things, but for me and for my research team, this was a really good reminder of why it's important to, even if it's uncomfortable, really say what we're talking about, because otherwise it's really easy for it to get lost. Okay. So here's a way that we have been thinking about access and just again for some terminology. So outreach being the have you thought about post-secondary education that can go back into middle school even. Um, that there's a bit of research that shows and I think you know it I think it makes sense to us that that would be, especially for students who are not in an embedded path, that that would be the place to really start our access programs. One of the difficulties, though, that we have found in looking at access programs and talking to people at different universities is it's really hard to to show the payoff for that early. It's really hard to keep track of kids, from middle school into post-secondary, and they might go somewhere other than your institution, which is probably, great from an access point of view, but even harder to keep track of. So unfortunately, that isn't where we see a lot of the access. Recruitment, I mean, that's certainly access, but it's very much about come to our university. We're going to tell you about us. Maybe you're not applying to us because you don't know all how wonderful we are. Admission is where we have my little group has focused a lot of our attention, partly because that's one of the things at the university that we really can do something about. And in a program, we can really look at how decisions are being made and admissions, and try to make sure that that's really being done in ways that reflect our values. And then finally, retention. Of course, it goes without saying that getting people in and then them finding, for example, that it isn't a welcoming environment, back to that word welcoming, that it isn't some place where they really can feel that they can bring their whole selves, as one of my colleagues has been phrasing it, is not enough. So retention is absolutely important, and I'm just gonna map those barriers that we talked about earlier onto here as well, right? So remember I said we don't see a whole lot of access back in the skills and knowledge, where somebody's coming in perhaps with weak academic preparation, not having the kind of academic opportunities. That's something we really need to try ideally to address way back in middle school. Um, Lack of knowledge about post-secondary, that's something that universities can try to address at recruitment, and so that's one of the places they often go. And then financial resources is something that comes in right around um, admission, and so again but we may have lost people before that. So again, this is a framework that it's probably sounds like I'm spending a lot of time, and I am spending a lot of time on terminology and frameworks and things that we have found really useful. Um, but but the reason I guess I didn't used to do that. The reason I do that is sometimes as much as the research itself, I find sometimes these definitions and these models are what people can really take away with them and use. And so actually we were really delighted. This model, which we created for that project that was funded by the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario, we presented it at a conference within U of T, and we were so delighted to see it then pop up in some of the stuff that the Faculty of Medicine was doing. As that they had found this really useful as a way for them to map the different kinds of access initiatives that they were doing. So again, I offer that in case it's a useful way of kind of picking things apart and thinking about them. Okay, so I'm finally getting to the two papers that I think some of you read. And I'm just going to talk a bit about kind of what brought us to the papers and what I think are the big takeaways. So I mentioned in that very long preamble. And don't worry, it's the talk itself is not going to be as long. In that very long preamble, I've mentioned a few times assumptions about that we might make about why people aren't coming to our programs. And one of the things that I was working with, so the colleagues who are on this paper with me are um, uh, Mark Hansen, who at the time, he was in charge of admissions for the Faculty of Education. Sandra Carnegie Douglas was the chief anti-racism officer at U of T, and she had been so generous with her time at OISE, helping us really try to think about these ideas and how they might fit in with some of the bigger conversations at the university. And Alexis Archbold was leading admissions at the Faculty of Law. And we've been having some of these conversations kind of across faculties. And one of the things that we kept coming back to was that so many of the conversations about access within U of T seem to start and end with, hey, we heard about this really cool thing that somebody else is doing, and so we ought to do that too, right? So, it would be things like, you ought to see the part of the website that this group has built for our Indigenous applicants, right? For example, or you really ought to see the kind of um, outreach that this group is doing with students in high school and bringing them to campus and so forth. And it seemed to, it started there, but it also seemed to end there, right? That people were mostly just kind of looking out there at what other people were doing, kind of trying to figure out what seemed to be working or what intuitively seemed like a good idea, and not really kind of even asking, why do we think this would work, right? And if it is working for the other group, why would that be? And actually, beyond that, are some of the assumptions maybe a little bit worrying. So a simple example is again, this sort of websites, materials. We just need to encourage members of underrepresented groups to consider post-secondary, right? You hear that's you hear that so often as part of, or unfortunately sometimes the whole access initiative for programs. And I guess, we started among ourselves kind of talking about, like, what are we assuming there, right? We're assuming that maybe people, either they don't know about us and they need to know more, and if they knew us, they would love us and they would come, or maybe they know about us and they have the impression that they won't actually be welcome, that they might be the only one, from their community who's there. um, and so maybe if we just say encouraging things, that will change that impression. I I'm sure all of you are having the same thought I'm having right now, which is, saying to people that they're welcome when they look at your campus and they maybe don't see other people like them there, probably isn't going to go very far. And so just really trying to be explicit about, like, what are we assuming? Why do we think this would work? What are we assuming? And if that assumption is not something we'd want to admit publicly, we probably ought to really look at why else there might be reasons that people aren't applying. Maybe we really do have really a justified reputation that is not very flattering, and maybe we need to do something about that. But anyway, we really ought to interrogate that. And then if we do, think this does make sense, and it's something that we're comfortable with, then we ought to be actually collecting some data to find out whether it's working, right? And one of the things one of the reasons that I kind of ended up going to program evaluation to find, to try to find some tools to organize our conversations about it, is that in program evaluation, in making these kinds of charts, right, that we're going to do this intervention, and then what is it that we think the problem is that's going to be addressed, and then how is that going to change the outcome. We also in the program evaluation models is the idea that there are multiple places that things might fail, and so there might be actually multiple places that we need to collect data. So for example, it might be that um, that you know that actually our idea, whatever it is, we're going to do some kind of communication that is going to give people information that they need. Maybe that actually makes sense. If it doesn't end up working, I mean, we need to find out actually whether we did get more applications. If we didn't get more applications, we'd also need to know maybe our message didn't actually reach people, right? So we need to, we need to be collecting data around this. And remember a moment ago I said, and we don't collect data except very recently about that. So in fact, for a lot of and I would challenge you sometime, U of T has been compiling a list of access programs. I think they're up to 70. I have to say, U of T's central administration was astounded to discover that when they asked around, there were 70 access programs operating at U of T. I find it a bit troubling that they were astounded, because to me, that means they're running off the side of somebody's desk, because there are people who really believe in this and feel passionately about it and are doing it kind of in addition to their regular job. And I worry what's going to happen when they're not there anymore. But if you look at that list too, and I think it's maybe partly because people are doing it kind of in their spare time as a passion project often, there isn't any data being collected. And there's no way, in fact, given how little data is being collected, that we would actually be able to tell for most of our programs whether they were actually making a difference. So I think that's a real challenge. The example that I used in the in the paper was actually one drawing on some experience we had had at OISE, where our admissions committee had decided that requiring 300 hours of recent school-based teaching experience, mostly volunteer, as a requirement to get into a teacher education program was probably a barrier. And I think people were pretty unanimous about that. That probably was a problem, especially for people who might be new to Canada or who might already have family responsibilities where they can't just take off and volunteer that many hours. They may not have access to schools. So the committee got rid of this requirement. And if anybody's interested at some point, I can tell you that was a crazy experience where some people on the committee actually weren't in agreement and went around behind other people and went to the registrar's office and said, please don't make it really clear on the website that we don't require 300 hours anymore, because maybe people won't notice. Because it was absolutely insane. It took one of my grad students and I a summer actually interviewing people to piece together exactly the crazy situation that had happened. But in any case, the problem was that in fact, and we tried the same grad student and I actually, we pulled a sample of applications from the registrar's office. We looked at every 10th application to try to figure out whether people were still reporting 300 hours, whether the proportion of people reporting 300 hours was different for some of the subgroups that we had very little demographic data, but the little bits of demographic data that we had, basically, as you see in that paper, we were never able to really tell whether or how much of a difference this made. which I think was really sobering for us. And it led us then to really that more than a decade of research that included collecting demographic information and so forth. So we would be able to. So this is one of those things that we got rid of it. We never let it come back. But I have to admit that that is completely on faith. We believe it made a difference in the end, eventually, when we finally got it off the website and so forth. But we actually are never going to be able to provide you with any evidence, which is really worrying. And then I'm gonna skip over a little bit here. Um, I'm just gonna touch a little bit on the other paper that I know some of you may have read ahead. And this was really trying to explore what we could do once we did start collecting demographic data. So that earlier 300 hours, and then realizing actually we had no way of knowing, and we made numerous other changes um, in our admissions process over the years. And until we managed to come up with demographic questions that people were comfortable asking, we explained very much how they were going to be used. We finally ended up with a set of demographic questions where we were getting more than 90% of our applicants responding. And then we were actually able to finally answer some of the questions that we had. And so this the two little examples in this other paper were showing what we can do with that. So one of the analyses we did was to try to figure out where we were losing people and if we were disproportionately losing some groups. So, and this was partly in response to the fact that when we sat around the admissions committee table, people had really, really strong beliefs about what would work and what didn't. And so we'd have people say, you've got to get rid of, the marks or the degree because that's a barrier for this group or that group. Or actually, one of the things that people really believed was that writing essays, some of which had to do with social justice and so forth, were going to be impossible for people coming from STEM degrees. And so this, I have to admit, some of this work was partly because we got tired of sitting at that table and having people say, I know in my heart that this is true, and in not having any way to really, to really test it. So this was us trying to test it. And we ended up going back to really to survival analysis, which is something that you do in medicine to kind of see, where in a disease progression, for example, you lose people. Now here, fortunately, nobody's dying, but we are losing people from the eligible applicant pool. And as they go through the stages, and so I won't explain this in great detail, but you can see that on the first, completeness of the application and English proficiency, it was just about the same whether people were first generation or not first generation. Um, but but things diverged a little bit when we got to the degree and the marks, and then came back together with the essays. It was much more stark with the with our Aboriginal applicants, where we were much more likely to lose them when we got to checking for the marks, right? And so that's where, that sends you back to look at, like, what are some other marks? Isn't the only thing. What's some other evidence? Are there other, are there other things that we can do there? We really don't want to be losing a quarter of the people who've made it to that point at that stage. So that's just an example of one thing. And then the other thing we did was we just tried to model. And again, if you're interested, that's all in that paper. But we just tried to model, like, who would have gotten in if we had ignored the essays, for example, right? Or we had looked only at the essays, or we had just kind of done a first screening and then done random selection. Or what if we had actually once we looked at who was eligible, we had then prioritized everybody who was Aboriginal, or we prioritized everybody who was Aboriginal and first generation, and so forth. And one of the things that you see is, this is the percentage of first generation that I'm showing here, and really the only thing that moved first generation was actually taking that explicitly into account. If we were to take that explicitly into account in our admissions, that would significantly change their chance of getting in and the makeup of the incoming class. But fussing with the other things, contrary to what other people fervently believed, actually wasn't going to help. And then we did the same thing with Aboriginal. So I'm just gonna, just three quick thoughts to leave you with, and these won't surprise you from what I've said before here, but our criteria, our selection rules, what we do in Access is often based on tradition, on our guesses, on our really well-meaning assumptions. And I think one of the things that we owe it to ourselves and our potential students is to really question those, to not be content with saying our assumptions are really based on good intentions, and so we're good to go, right? To really try to test those. And then finally, yeah, the need for demographic data. And I can't say, how encouraged I am by finally seeing some movement at U of T about that. Okay, Shakina, I am going to stop sharing my screen, or if you want to, there, okay.